I think it's important to understand that emotions are the result or the byproduct of this situation. And they're simply there to tell us something important. That's it, right? Sadness means I lost something I cared about. And fear means something bad is going to happen. And guilt means I did something wrong. And anger means someone else did something I don't like. So we have all of these emotions that are just giving us messages about the situation. But the problem is emotions can be very overwhelming and very difficult to deal with. And that opens the door for all kinds of really not so helpful coping efforts.
You're listening to episode 191 of the Building Psychological Strength podcast, where we uncover the information, tools, and techniques to turn our mind into our most valuable asset.
The courage to face fears with persistence.
Being able to be present enough in this moment to choose my response thoughtfully.
We have the strength to bend to life stressors, to bend to adversity without snapping, without breaking.
There are only 6 things that contribute to our quality of life, and they are all experiences.
In every moment, we are deciding who we want to be and how we want to live our lives.
Noticing what your brain is doing and then being able to make choices.
Mobilize the things that we know lift us up.
Hi, everybody. Welcome back to the Building Psychological Strength podcast. My name is April, and I'm your host. Before we dive into this week's content, I want to take just a minute to just pause and to acknowledge where you might be at right now with your life. I've heard from a number of people in my close circle about what the start of the school year has been like for their family. There's a lot of preparations that have been made. There are a lot of difficult decisions that have been made. People have really upended big proportions of their life and their houses. How many people's formal dining rooms are gone now and are homeschooling rooms? So much change has happened in order to accommodate this school year, which is very out of the ordinary and has a lot of people having to juggle a lot. So I wanted to take just a minute to acknowledge that we hear you and we see you, and it's not easy. And there's so many people going through it. And sometimes that doesn't make you feel better to know that everybody else is in a tough situation too, because it doesn't change your situation. But sometimes it does a little bit to know that you're not in it by yourself, that so many people that you reach out to can understand and empathize with at least a proportion of what you're going through, because we're all going through it as a nation. Although in individual households, it's a very individualized situation. Something that we put together a while back and released is a resource for people who are going through this time when they're feeling like they've got a lot on their plate. If you're feeling like you're getting perfectionistic and starting to beat yourself up because somehow you're not able to be a full-time employee and a full-time teacher at the same time, like, boo on you, you're only one person, I can't believe you, right? Our perfectionism takes over, we get down on ourselves, we start to beat ourselves up, we get anxious and we worry about the future. What will happen to my kids? Are they going to fall behind? And we feel overwhelmed. And if that at all describes you, we have a free resource that we released about a month ago at this point, but I want to bring it up again because stuff's starting to get real and school is going and everyone's juggling all the things. This resource that we have for you, it's 3 modules that are meant to be used intervention style in the moment when you're feeling overwhelmed, when you're feeling worried, when you're feeling perfectionistic and getting down on yourself. These are about 3-minute modules, 3 to 5 minutes, that you can use in the moment to restore peace of mind, calm, ease, more of a sense of balance. They are interventions that are meant to help you be a bit more compassionate with yourself, balance your thinking a bit more, and really start to build psychological strength through a time that's really difficult for people. If this at all sounds interesting to you, head over to peakmindpsychology.com/support We'll put this link in the episode description as well to make it really easy for you. If you sign up there, you will get immediate, as in that moment, access to these 3 modules. And not only that, you'll get some really great weekly content about how you can continue to build psychological strength, and it's all absolutely free. So peakmindpsychology.com/support, or scroll down on your podcast app, click on the link in the description. You can get that for free. And just know that we are here for you during this time. It's not easy, and you're doing great. I'm sure you're working as hard as you can. You're doing your best. So take care of yourself, and please take us up on this offer with this free resource. We would love to see you there and would love to connect with you that way. Okay, this week is also very related. The topic of this week's podcast episode is very, very related to the situation that a lot of people are in with the school year, but beyond that. Psych strength, it's all lovely and flowery and roses and puppies and wonderful jaunts through nature when life is going really well. And things are easy. It's easy to say that you're thriving when life is going well, but when adversity happens, when things get difficult, when they get overwhelming, when you face the loss of someone or the loss of something in your life that was really important to you and you have to cope, that's when psychological strength becomes a true asset. And when all the work that you've done outside of that situation becomes very valuable. So today we want to talk about coping from the standpoint of this dichotomy. And we'll get into what I mean by that, but 2 types of coping. We want to go into them so that you can understand and be a little bit more thoughtful about how you might be handling difficult situations in your own life. I'm excited that Ashley is back on the podcast. Hello, excited you're here.
Hi, happy to be here and excited to talk about coping. It's probably one of the words that I say more often than almost any other in my psychology practice, because it's all about coping is just how you handle things. And sometimes people have really healthy and effective and adaptive coping skills, and sometimes people have really poor ones. And I'm excited today, not just to talk about healthy versus unhealthy coping, but to talk about it in a much more, I think, robust way, because we're going to talk about emotion-focused coping and problem-focused coping. And my guess is those are concepts that you may not have encountered before, but you'll know them as we get into them and start to talk about what it really means and what it looks like. And then hopefully we'll give you some new insights and tips so that you can cope in both domains in really effective ways.
Mm-hmm. Now, as we dive into this, I want people listening to this to think about a time when you felt like you had to cope, and don't feel like you need to go to the worst depths of the worst thing that's ever happened to you. Just bring up a challenge that you've encountered recently, something that has been difficult, that you've had to move through, something where you've struggled a bit and hit some friction. Get that in your mind right now as you think about and listen to the rest of this episode, because I think it'll really help clarify, as Ashley said, what we mean by emotion-focused and problem-focused coping, and will just make things all the more concrete for you as you think through how you might apply this in your own life. So let's dive in with emotion-focused coping. So all of you, right, you have this scenario in your head of something difficult that happens, and tough stuff happens to us, right? We experience adversity. And Ashley, how do we feel in those situations?
Oh man, people want to say bad. And
bad.
Then that puts me on a soapbox, because bad is not a feeling. And which starts our, emotion-focused coping. But right, when we have these situations that come up, if we're having to cope with them, that means we're having to handle something. There's some sort of negative or unpleasant or painful emotion that's coming up, right? It might be fear or sadness or grief or shame or embarrassment or anger. What am I missing?
Guilt, resentment.
Yeah, all of this ick, right? And it's really interesting, because we have really not always healthy relationships with our emotions. And so I think as we, get into coping, even just taking us a little bit of a detour to talk about emotional intelligence and understanding emotions makes a lot of sense, because these situations happen and you have an emotional reaction. Why? Because you're human, right? And we have emotions for a reason. And so a lot of times, I think it's important to understand that emotions are the result or the byproduct of this situation. And they're simply there to tell us something important. That's it, right? Sadness means I lost something I cared about. And fear means something bad is going to happen. And guilt means I did something wrong. And anger means someone else did something I don't like. So we have all of these emotions that are just giving us messages about the situation. But the problem is emotions can be very overwhelming and very difficult to deal with. And that opens the door for all kinds of really not so helpful coping efforts.
Right. Well, to go back to the B word that you used, bad. The reason why we label that suite of emotions as bad is because for a lot of people, they're very aversive. For all of us, right? Not a lot of people, everybody, they don't feel good. And for the vast upper 90% of people, we don't want to feel that way. Right. We don't enjoy being in a quote bad mood, having difficult emotions, experiencing especially strong, difficult emotions. We don't want it. And I can understand why somebody would do what we're going to talk about here and focus on emotion-focused coping, which is basically to set this dichotomy up. This is, you're in a situation that's difficult and you have emotions as a result of that situation. What are you coping with? Are you coping with your emotions or are you coping with the situation at hand? And if you're focused on coping with your emotions, I understand that, right? They don't feel good. We want to make them go away. And there's a lot to unpack there because knee-jerk reaction, when something feels bad, what is our first instinct? What's the first thing we want to do? Get rid of it. Avoid, right? Ashley, how well does avoidance work?
Oh man, it doesn't. It doesn't. Like it's because here, well, let me clarify that. It works in the short term, but problematic avoidance, it causes problems, right? Like, okay, so let's say if you're trying to cope with your emotions, so that's where you're focusing your coping energy and efforts, these feelings, I want to resolve them or get rid of them. So what do? You have a glass or two of wine. Okay, maybe that takes the edge off. But what happens when that one or two isn't enough and it's 3 or 4 or it's every day, right? Can you see how that effort to control or alleviate those emotions can end up causing some problems? What about eating? How many people eat their feelings, right? Even that phrase that's out there and it's, we do it to self-soothe, right? I'm going to have some ice cream because it's going to make me feel better. Or I'm going to overeat because it's going to make me feel better. And it's natural to look for comfort. But in that case, you're trying to cope with these emotions in a way that's really going to end up causing some problems.
Especially if it's the only thing you're doing.
Bingo.
Right?
Yeah. And beyond like substances and food, people go with preemptive avoidance, right? This is going to be hard or stressful or scary or uncomfortable. So I'm just not even going to put myself in that situation. So it's just like avoiding the emotions coming up altogether.
Yeah.
That causes problems too, right? Like we've talked about boundaries before, right? When you don't set a boundary, resentment is the effect. So that short-term avoidance equals longer-term problems.
And we've talked a lot about on the podcast about how our mind tends to operate in associations. We develop these heuristics. We develop these really quick ways of responding. And a lot of time, and those associations form in a number of ways. We've had this discussion quite a few times, but one way is, through a sort of a cause and effect, right? I did this and this thing happened and those things pair together in our minds. Another way that can form though is through opposites or things that we are focusing on a lot, so as to make them not occur. It sounds crazy, but the harder you're working on something, the more you're chewing on it. Even if you're chewing on not being it, you can strengthen that association by accident because you're still chewing on it. It's your chocolate cake example. Perfectly.
Right. Right. It's like whatever you do, don't think about chocolate cake. And you're all smiling because that's what the first thing that pops in your mind, right? Like, don't think about it. We think about it. That's just how the human mind works.
And I love that too. This goes back to like how much working memory we have in any given moment. You're putting so much capacity of that working memory on avoid, avoid, avoid. Don't think about that thing that's happening. Don't think about it. It's going to make you sad. You're working really, really hard. And alcohol does this. It helps sort of squash some of that, or substances or food for some people. All that stuff you mentioned helps squash some of that for people. But then the second you let up, the second you let it go, it's like there's pent up energy there that has to go somewhere. And you've now spent a bunch of your cognitive resources trying to squash this thing back, and it comes roaring back in your mind.
Yeah, it's like trying to shove a beach ball underwater, right? If you're like, I need to get rid of this beach ball, I don't want it in my swimming pool. So you're shoving it underwater. One, that takes effort and energy. And as soon as you stop shoving, for whatever reason, it's going to bop up and hit you in the face. And that's what happens with our emotions when they are the natural byproducts of the situation we're in, right? Like we're going to feel them. And if we try to get rid of them, it doesn't work. It causes more problems. Yeah.
And I love where you went there. It's a great opening to talk about something that you've brought up on this podcast before around manufactured emotions, because it's almost like we're trying really hard not to feel the negative emotion that is a natural situation, and then we pile on and make it worse for ourselves. So I'd love if you could describe that, because it's so relevant here.
Yeah, and that's exactly where my mind went to, April, is, this is information that I think everybody really needs to understand. And it's part of that emotional intelligence is one, recognizing how you actually feel. Bad is not a feeling, good's not a feeling. So what am I actually feeling? But then understanding the difference between natural and manufactured emotions. And some people will call them primary and secondary, meaning like first and then second. But I like natural and manufactured, because natural means anybody in this situation would be feeling this way. This is the natural byproduct of being in this situation. If a loved one dies, you feel sad. That's very natural. But then we have these manufactured ones, and manufactured meaning they're created, and they're created by our minds. And so here's what can happen is, let's say right now, as just the mess that is 2020, and in the fall and school going back, there's a lot to deal with. And a very natural response in this situation for a lot of people is feeling overwhelmed, feeling stressed. And then we have these manufactured emotions that kick in when you start to judge yourself for feeling that way. As soon as you say, I shouldn't be feeling overwhelmed. Oh my gosh, so many other people have it so much worse than I am. I shouldn't be feeling this way. Boom, now you've got guilt on top of it. Or when something happens and you add all of the extra to it, right? Like I love the phrase, and I've probably said it here before, like just because life gives you a cactus doesn't mean you have to sit on it. So right now you've got a cactus, but then if your mind is adding all of this extra, oh my gosh, this is horrible, I can't handle it, there's just no way, I'm going to let everybody down. So you're adding all this extra commentary that creates or manufactures emotions as well. And the reason why I think it's important to know is because when we're not clear about this and we just lump it all in together and we try to treat it the same way or cope with it in the same way, that's where problems happen. Natural emotions, you have to feel. There's no way to shortcut it, right? Like you got to feel it. And if you're trying to shortcut and get around it, that's all of those avoidance tactics we were just talking about. It doesn't work. That beach ball will bop you in the face. Manufactured emotions, though, if we don't kind of recognize, oh, wait a minute, this is extra coming from my mind, and that committee in our minds, which we've talked about a couple episodes ago, If you don't recognize that, then we end up wallowing in it. And so we need to get really clear, because emotions are muddy. It's really muddy. And we need to kind of tease it apart and figure out how to cope effectively with it.
Mm-hmm. One of the analogies I've given for why therapy is so amazing is this paint analogy. And I've used it on the podcast before, but imagine you have like a big bucket and you've got a bunch of little buckets of paint of all different colors that you're going to put in this big bucket. So you take the little bucket of red and you dump it in the bucket, and the bucket's red and it looks pure and it's really easy to understand what color is in there. You're like, well, okay, that's red. And then you dump the blue paint in and you're like, ooh, it's getting murky now. And then you chuck some yellow in there and some green in there and some black in there and some purple in there. And pretty soon you've got like this muddy gray color. Our emotions can feel like that. What we're teaching you right now, and what therapy will teach you in situations where, you know, that's the appropriate place for you to go, is how to get the red paint out again, how to get the blue paint out again, how to get the yellow paint out again, so that you can look at it for what it is. This is not murky yuck together. No, my sadness and I'm going to use my, dad passing away. My sadness and my grief, red paint. Right. That is its own situation that there is no way to fast track that and make that feel better. The guilt that I'm feeling because I wasn't a perfect daughter and didn't, do everything perfectly for him or whatever, that's added stuff, but it's its own color of paint. And the anger that I feel at him for not taking his own health seriously and, making decisions and whatever, that's its own color and deserves its own focus and coping strategy. So I use this example, and I'm glad, Ashley, that you went into this, because it's God, all of this stuff is so related. It's hard not to do every episode we've ever done and rehash them every time we're back on the podcast, but look up stuff where we talk about fact versus fiction. Right. It is a very similar situation where you're trying to tease apart what are the facts here, meaning what are the times where any normal person would feel exactly the same way as I do, and what's the added stuff. That is a skill that you can develop. That is a skill that's part of psych strength. That is a skill you should be practicing even when times are good, because man, when they're bad and they're tough and they're adverse and they're gritty and they're awful, you'll thank yourself for it.
Yeah.
So, keep going.
Yeah, no, and I was just going to say, I love that. And just to kind of put a bow on it, it's because healthy coping for red paint and yellow paint looks a little different. Mm-hmm. And I think that it's kind of a nice way to segue into like problem focused coping, if you're good with that.
Yeah, let's do it.
Is, we want to, like, when we look at, okay, what are you coping with? Are you trying to cope with your feelings and you're trying to suppress something that, no, it needs to be here? Or are you focused on the problem? And are you trying to cope with this problem and this finding a solution to resolve it or change it in some way? And there are times when that makes a lot of sense. And there are times when people approach that in not the most helpful ways either. And I guess the thing that comes to mind when it comes to coping with the problem is looking at, is it something that can be changed? Is it something that I have control over or not? And I think getting really clear about that can help. But making either a plan, finding a solution, but these are the things I'm going to do, or the answer is acceptance. Acknowledging I can't change this. This is the way it is, and I'm going to work on acceptance. And so sometimes that's where your coping efforts need to go.
I can feel everybody getting mad right now, because I used to, with that word, I actually remember a therapist who I saw at one point in time in my life who I got extremely angry at when she said, I think you're going to have to practice acceptance. I'm like, I'm going to punch you in the face. I didn't obviously say that to her or do that, but that's how I felt. Let's tease apart acceptance and then tease apart that more active ability to change it, what you have control over. Because going back to the situation, you've lost a loved one, right? That's probably the easiest one to pick on with this, is that somebody you love, whether it's a family member or a friend or someone close to you, has passed away, is there anything you can do to change that situation?
Oh,
No, there's not a thing you can do. And acceptance, to be clear, it doesn't mean that you like the situation. It doesn't mean that you agree with it. It doesn't mean that in that moment, you're going to look at it and you're going to say, you know what, this happened for a reason. That's okay. It's okay.
right.
It isn't that at all. It's acknowledging that this is what happened and I don't have control over it.
That's it. And I think because I run into this too, both in my own life, right, and with my own personal acceptance journeys and working with people, is that term gets misunderstood. And it really, all we mean by acceptance is acknowledging things as they actually are and not struggling against it, right?
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes people are familiar with the stages of grief, right? Like denial and anger and depression and bargaining. The ends in acceptance, which is where you acknowledge, I lost this person. They're not coming back, and let go of the anger. And you're not living in denial anymore. And that's all we mean. Acceptance does not mean approval. It does not mean that you like it. It does not mean that you are just hopelessly, defeatedly resigned to it either. It's kind of just saying, oh, it is what it is, which I know that phrase really kind of pushes buttons for people too, but it's dropping, well, the metaphor dropping the rope is what pops in mind, right? Like if you're tug of warring back and forth with this problem, like for me, the biggest example of a visual impairment. So I'm losing sight. And for a long time, that was really a source of pain and struggle. And I can say now that I've gotten to a point of acceptance, doesn't mean I like it. And my gosh, if you gave me a choice, continue with vision loss or take 20/20, I'm gonna take 20/20 any day, hands down. But what I'm not doing is wallowing anymore. What I'm not doing is tug of warring back and forth with I can't be happy if I'm losing vision, or why me, or I can't do things because of this. Now it's much more of, okay, cool, this is what I can see, and moving on. What am I going to do about it? Doesn't mean I like it. I'm not grateful for it. It just is what it is. And I'm not adding any extra by struggling, wishing it to be different when I have zero power to change it.
I love that you said, I'm not grateful for it. I think you just gave people permission to just be in the yucky situation. There's so much focus right now. This is PS. One of the biggest things we're trying to do with this podcast is actually give you real, like, evidence-based psychology information, not somebody's opinion that is in some Barnes and Noble book who hasn't had any training or whatever. And this idea that you should just be grateful for every situation that happens to you, find the silver lining right away, just think positively. That is not how it works. It isn't.
Mm-mm.
You talked about the process. I keep going back to grieving because it's the, again, most clear one to point out, like, there's nothing you can do to change the situation. You talked about the process of grieving. And a lot of times when we talk about acceptance, people think, oh, just accept it. Like, bang, like now, like today.
Yeah.
It
They're
isn't.
trying to will it. Well,
it isn't.
No, in that case, people are trying to bypass the feelings.
Yeah.
I don't want to feel this. I don't want to separate my pain. I just want to dump the pain out altogether and wash my hands and be done. You can't.
Mm-hmm. And recognizing, so you may have experienced with grief that it's like ocean waves, right? It just, like, another wave will come out of nowhere. It's almost like for a moment you forgot that you were in this situation. That's not the right word, but it's the best one I've come up with to describe it. And then another wave comes and you're like, what the heck is this now? And it's in those moments being able to do exactly what you said before with emotion-focused coping and saying, okay, what are my thoughts about this situation? What am I adding to the situation? Is this helpful to me right now? Is this changing it at all? I've had a lot of thoughts. My dad passed away when I was a very young child, and I am now an adult now. I think we can all say that 30 years goes by nearly for me, and you're kind of a different person after 30 years of life that goes by. I've wondered in the past, I have different views, values, political thoughts, religious thoughts, the list goes on. than what I think my dad might have had. Would we get along now? And whoa, and the wave comes, and I'm like, hang on. And where it's gotten to, and I just want to articulate this out because I want to give you like a here's a real life time when this has happened. I've had to think about, well, does it change the situation? If he wouldn't have, are you somehow different now, or is the situation somehow different now? No, it's not. And do you know that he wouldn't have? And 30 years passed. Do you know that he wouldn't have changed similarly?
Right.
Like all of these unknowns. And the point is, they are unknown and have nothing to do with the situation at hand. But that process of chewing through and working through and sitting with the ick is what problem focused coping is when you're working to a point of acceptance. It's chewing through the yuck and getting to a point where you're more at peace and can see the situation for what it is without clouding it with other things.
Absolutely. And that's different than like an active problem solving approach.
Yes, let's go there.
Here's a problem and I'm going to change it. And being able to, have the skills to effectively problem solve, come up with creative solutions, implement them, figure it out. And sometimes that's what you got to do, right? You have to say, here's a problem, I'll solve it. And then I have vanilla ice that immediately pops in.
Oh man, mine did too. Talk about a cognitive association.
Right? Sorry.
All
and
right,
I could
collaborate and
I know.
listen. I'll stop now.
I could just feel it coming too. But where I see people get really kind of stuck in this problem focused is they're not really doing either. They're in this like icky limbo land. It's a situation that they don't like, and they are either not willing or able to change it, and they're not willing or able to accept it. And I really see it as, we use the term choice point often, and at least in our conversations and understanding. And in any given situation, there's a choice point where you can choose to go down one path or another. And this is just one illustration of that, right? Like I can choose to problem solve and change, or I can choose to accept. But I see so many people just like give up and sit down and get stuck in the mud right there. Bodies often come to mind, right? If you're unhappy with your body, okay, is it something you can change? You could eat differently, you could exercise differently. Would that change something? Or work on body love, body acceptance, and kind of embrace it. I guess it's not necessarily an either or, because you could do both. But I see so many people just stuck in this limbo land of, this is unacceptable to me. I'm unwilling to embrace it and not doing anything about it. And that creates a lot of ick.
I think about too, some of the stuff that we repeatedly hear when we do life design related work. This choice point PS is something that is part of the corporate workshops that we do. We do sort of a half day mini life design crash course, or psych strength / life design crash course. Anyway, this choice point is a part of it. And when you think about being unhappy in your job, you can do something about it, but that will likely mean setting a boundary, having a difficult conversation, asking for more money, quitting your job, doing things that are difficult, or you can stay there. But either one of them, and this brings us right back to emotions.
Right.
Quitting your job, having the conversation, setting the boundary, asking for more money, telling the person no, saying yes to the thing that's bigger than you think you can handle. I could keep going. They will all come with the baggage of difficult to handle emotions that we just have to be okay with sitting with, or get better at sitting with. And that in and of itself, the ability to sit with difficult emotions. I feel angry. I feel guilty. I feel jealous. I'm nervous about this. Think about difficult conversations, right? Can you ever get to the point where you feel completely comfortable going up to your boss and telling them that they said something that was really hurtful to you? That's never going to feel totally comfortable. You're always going to have to go through some icky feelings to get there. And that decision about how you're going to handle it is the active coping with the problem that comes along with, as we said at the beginning of this episode, what are you primarily focused on coping with? The emotions are going to come along for the ride while you're coping with the situation at hand. Whether that's changing or accepting, you're going to have emotions with it. It's just natural.
Yeah. Well, and that's where we get to accept emotions too, right? I feel anxious, period. Mm-hmm. And I'm going to allow it to be there. I'm going to let that beach ball float on the surface of the water while I do whatever it is that's important to me.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. It's good stuff. And it makes me think too, we do, if you're interested in learning more and diving deep into this, we have our Ascend program as well, goes into this in a lot more detail and a lot more concrete, hands-on dealing with emotions and this choice point, but it's a more robust, kind of fleshed out kind of way.
Oh yeah. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
As we end this episode, I want to talk about a couple of just actionable things. So we've already hit on one, acceptance, and to give it its more common name, mindfulness. Being able to be more of an observer about the thoughts and the feelings and the bodily sensations, the urges you're having in any given situation, but particularly when times are really difficult and you are having to cope with some emotions that are hard in situations that are not frictionless or frictionless. That's the word.
Yeah.
I was like, wait, did I just say the opposite of what I meant to say? But being able to be more of a mindful observer without judging, adding, that is such a huge part. When
you take that mindfulness approach, you're taking out the judgment. You're not adding that manufactured emotional component.
Correct.
Right? Like, and then you can extend on mindfulness with self-compassion. Right? It builds. You gotta have the mindfulness piece in order to practice the self-compassion, but that's so huge too. And that's it allows you to handle difficult or painful or unwanted emotions in a different way than beating yourself up or criticizing yourself or numbing out. And we think that it's such an important skill that's why that's one of those freebies in that support resource that April was talking about at the beginning of this episode. So definitely check that out.
And self-compassion, when we talk about it here, we're not talking about sort of an undirected, diffused way of saying nice things to yourself. There's actually almost an equation or a formula to it that has specific components. And as Ashley mentioned, it's in that free set of interventions, modules, tools, whatever you want to call them. And that tool, literally all you have to do is hit play and do what it says. Hit play and think the things it tells you to think, or go the place mentally that it asks you to go. And it'll guide you through that formula that data has shown can really help you cultivate this more peaceful, mindful, less judgmental, balanced state of mind that helps restore you to feeling maybe not normal, perfect, whatever, the way you're accustomed to feeling when you're not in adversity, but at least bring you back from that point where you're feeling like, wow, I'm acutely feeling like I'm in a crisis right in this moment. It can restore some of that balance thinking.
Yeah. I just have this phrase going through my mind real quick of like, it's not about feeling better. It's about feeling better, right? Like you can't expect to be peaceful and calm and joyous in the face of adversity. That's not natural.
Right. Right. I hope this was helpful for folks. I as we talked about at the beginning of this episode, we collectively as a group in the world right now are not going through an easy time. And individually, so that's kind of the macro approach to this, but the micro approach is that individually in our lives, we're going through ups and downs all the time. And one of the big reasons why Ashley and I are so passionate about the work that we're doing is because we're giving people exercises that they can do and quote unquote practice so that when the big game comes, when adversity actually happens in your life, which it will for all of us repeatedly, that's just a part of life, you have built up the skills that will allow you to thrive through it. And thrive through it doesn't mean ignore it or pretend to be positive. Thrive through it means you can come out the other side finding meaning, potentially finding peace, and being able to move on and continue to follow your values and live the biggest life that you can, knowing that you went through something difficult. So I hope this episode was helpful for you as you think about how to approach adversity in your own life. And if we can ever be a resource to you, you can always shoot us an email at info@peakmindpsychology.com. We would love to hear from you. Any last thoughts?
Nope. I think we need to wrap it up.
Love it. Okay. And that resource again for folks who want that link one more time is peakmindpsychology.com/support. You can get those 3 interventions, tools, techniques that you can use in the moment to restore balance and peace. We'd love to see you there. Thanks so much for tuning in this week. This was a really important conversation that I think we all need to hear and have at this time. Thanks, you guys. Tell me if this sounds like you. I'll finally be happy. I'll finally take a breath. I'll finally find some balance when I get through this crazy season of life. We hear that from so many people, and the fact is, many times, life is just a crazy season. All of it. Between your career, your family, your community obligations, attempting to have a social life, and trying to fit in self-care, whatever that is, we end up feeling stretched so thin. Now, I want to challenge you to think about things differently. Rather than focusing on external circumstances and their impact on your happiness, your sense of ease and balance, and your mental well-being, what if, instead, you focused on something you can actually control? What if you built the psychological strength that would allow you to thrive through life when things are going well and even when they're not? What if you could feel less scattered, more in control, less anxious, more peaceful and joyful? We want that for you too. That's why we are so beyond excited to announce the beta release of our signature Psych Strength Building program, Ascend. This program combines evidence-based tools, techniques, and information from the fields of psychology and life design to focus on 3 important modules: you, your mind, and your life. Learn your unique combination of strengths, values, and identity, and the ways in which they interact and lead you to approach life in your unique way. Dig into your mind to understand the conscious and subconscious processes that act as a lens through which you experience life. And finally, harness the power of life design to begin to steer your life into alignment with who you uniquely are. Enrollment in this beta round of Ascend is open now, and because it's our beta round, the price is astonishingly low. So if you have ever had even a suspicion that you could benefit from building psychological strength through a guided, science-backed experience, now is the time. Visit www.peakmindpsychology.com/ascend for more information and to join us. Friends, it is time to build psychological strength. It's time to live by design and not by default. It is time to live like your life depends on it, because it does. Join us in Ascend by visiting www.peakmindpsychology.com/ascend. That's www.peakmindpsychology.com/ascend. It's a simple fact that nearly everyone in the world could benefit from building psychological strength, but not everyone will put in the time and effort to do so. But today you did. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Building Psychological Strength. Now, if you're interested in building the mental toughness, confidence, and resilience you need to thrive through life's ups and downs, visit us at www.peakmindpsychology.com. Also, if there's someone in your life who could benefit from this episode, please share it with them. And if you yourself found this episode valuable, meaning if you took away even one insight that you can use to build psychological strength in your own life, we would so appreciate it if you would drop us a rating and a review on iTunes. The thing is, the more ratings and reviews we have, the easier it is to get this powerful and important content out to the people who need to hear it. Remember, your mind can be your most valuable asset or your biggest liability, and you get to choose. So choose wisely, my friend. And I'll see you next time on Building Psychological Strength.